Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Kyle back with an extra episode this week for all of you. Because over the last 12 hours or so, your boy has been diving deep into as many data points and as much information as possible about the 2022 season. And really, from all of that data that I've pulled so far, from all the information that I've looked at, we've come to one conclusion that I need to share with you all today. Buckle in. Hop in the back. Have you ever been to like a zoo and you know how they have those safari things and you have the front car pulling and you've got all the cars through the back and we're looking at the landscape and the wild animals? That's what this is. We're looking at the wild scenery that is fantasy football. I'm your tour guide and you're all going to hop in with me for a little bit. Because the one conclusion that I have come to is that predicting fantasy football is absolutely impossible. Shocker, right? We've been telling you that for years. You know, on this channel, we've told you now for a while there's no such thing as a fantasy football expert. If you have expert in your title, if you put expert in an article or a video or whatever it may be, if you're calling yourself an expert at fantasy football, you're lying because there isn't one. There's no such thing as a fantasy football expert. It's impossible because the NFL has greatly changed, not over the last 15, 10 years, but even over the last 3 years, we've seen a significant change in the way the NFL game is played. And that has really, really made playing fantasy football and analyzing fantasy football and all these other things much more difficult than it has ever been before in this game. Now, if you've been around for the Fantasy Headliners for a while, we really pride ourselves in trying to change the way fantasy football content creation is done. And you saw a big change this year for us. Last year when we did our start and sit shows, we just put start and sit and we talked about it. This year we put actual data points into what makes a start and a sit. And we actually labeled a conclusive final score to help you make a decision. Because honestly, us telling you who to start and sit does no good because we're going to be wrong. So the best thing that we can do is just take as much information as possible, share it with you, and let you start to make some of those decisions as well. And then when you come to us and say, dude, this is such a tough decision, I really need some help for it or help with it, then we take all the information that we've gathered and we say to you, hey, this is what it looks like it could be. And that's why a lot of times when you hear us hear us respond to some of the questions, we say, well, this guy's going to be a little bit safer, but this guy is going to have a higher ceiling, because I don't believe there are correct answers anymore. There's only trying to make the best prediction possible. And I've got a lot of information that we are going to go through today to kind of help reassess that. Now, I've only got a few specific players that we're going to talk about, because if I were to do a video on how difficult it is for every single player, we'd be here for hours. We'd be here for hours. And I'm trying to keep this video around 10 to 15 minutes. And we'll probably break past that. So let's go ahead and take a look at some running backs first. And let me show you some data points again. It suggests how crazy fantasy football is these days. And we're going to kick it off with Austin Ekeler. Over the first 6 weeks of the season, now this was recorded before Monday Night Football, so there's nothing for 6 weeks. But over the first week of the 6 weeks of the season, we already see that 3 of those weeks were extremely difficult. 9 points in week 1, 13 in week 2, 9 in week 3, and then we see that huge jump to 31 and 33. Running back 1 numbers that we all expected to begin with. And at the beginning of the season, people were absolutely freaking out and panicking because Austin Ekeler wasn't doing what he was supposed to. Well, just take a look. This is how hard fantasy football is to predict, because of his first 3 games of the season, which were no good by any stretch of the imagination. Week 1 against Las Vegas, when he only scored 9 points. Well, Las Vegas allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And Austin Ekeler couldn't take advantage of that. In week 3, when he also had 9 points against Jacksonville, well, Jacksonville allows the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And that's before Deontay Jackson ripped him up this past week. So 2 really good matchups, 2 teams in the top 10 of fantasy points allowed so far this season on the slate for the Los Angeles Chargers, and Ekeler did absolutely nothing against either of them. How are we supposed to predict that? That on any given week, when a player has a great matchup, they're just going to disappear. You can't. There's no way to predict that. You've got studs that you draft, and this is another point that we tried to really relay to all of you. Sometimes you just got to stick with them and see what happens. And you can't give up hope. And for those of you that got rid of Austin Eckler after 3 games, you're kicking yourself in the tail end right now because the dude's finally producing. And yes, those softer matchups to begin the year, they probably hurt you a little bit. Running back is completely different than it used to be. For running backs, we now sit at a time where a majority of the league uses somewhat of a committee approach. Heck, we've started seeing teams go to 3 different running backs. 3. Miami's got 9,555 running backs on their roster, and they use every single one of them. San Francisco's probably going to be using 3 running backs coming up soon. Kansas City's using 3 running backs right now. And there's other teams as well. Heck, the Washington Commanders are also using 3 running backs. So now we're seeing teams say, okay, well, we've got a first down back who will probably take first and second down type of work. We've got a third down back that's going to be on the field and taking some pass catching and target opportunities. We've got maybe a goal line back and a short yardage back that we're going to put up there to really move the pile and storm. I mean, they're starting to use 3 running backs at a time, not just 2 anymore, which even solidifies more that if you've got a top of the first round pick, you use it on a running back. Because the most important thing that you can have for your fantasy football roster moving forward is a running back that you can put in and know that he's not going to be losing a ton of touches to other guys. Yes, we've seen some issues with scoring at running back this year, but if you tell me, hey, Kyle, in the first round, you can take a running back that averages 25 points a game, or you could take a wide receiver averaging 30 points a game, I'll take that running back every single time as long as you tell me he's going to be getting 80% of the snaps. Because I don't have to worry about that every single week. You know how difficult it's going to be trying to figure out running backs moving forward? But we're going to talk about how difficult it is to figure out wide receivers right now. Josh Jacobs is another one that we need to keep an eye on. I mean, the same thing with Austin Eckler. 7 points, 8 points, and 12 points over the first 3 weeks of the season. Okay, nothing great. People gave up. They moved on from Josh Jacobs. They said, not going to be that good. He's on a bye this week. But we get 32 points in week 4 and 27 points in week 5. The big kicker here is week 1 when he faced the Los Angeles Chargers, who allow the most fantasy points to running backs on the season. He only got 7 points. Another matchup where Josh Jacobs should have absolutely smashed. That if you were doing everything that you were supposed to, if you did all the research possible, it would tell you we start Josh Jacobs in this matchup, and he got you 7 points. Can't predict that. Can't figure it out. What about a guy like Miles Sanders, a guy that we weren't in love with coming into the season? We love Miles Sanders' talent. We think he's a very talented running back. The situation isn't the best, though. Because coming into the season, it looked like another backfield that was going to be split among a bunch of people. Now, in week 1, he had a great week. 17 points in week 1. Then he came back with 10 points. All right, a little bit of a drop. But then he comes back with 4 points. And you're like, all right, I'm done. In week 4, he jumps all the way to 28 points. You're like, all right, here we go. Miles Sanders back on the train. And then he gives you a week 5 where he gets 7 points. Now, do we trust him in week 6? Well, then he gets you 13 points. Yes, he might be a running back 3. Yes, you might not be reliant on him every single week, but it's that type of a performance right there that makes it more and more difficult to figure out whether or not we actually need to play Miles Sanders in any given week. Because if you take his worst performances this year, week 2 with 10 points, week 3 with 4 points, and week 4 with 28 points, all of those were against teams that were middle of the pack against running backs. So those actually should have been good matchups at least. They weren't bad matchups by any way, shape, or form. They were not the type of matchup that we look at and say, no, we can't play him there. No, they were actually decent matchups. actually decent matchups, especially when you look at a matchup like against Washington. Washington, a team having some issues. This is a team, the Philadelphia Eagles, playing very well. Run the ball against Washington, should be a superior team, and we don't really get anything. How are you supposed to know to start Miles Sanders if he's not even showing up in what should be some of the best matchups of the season for him? What about a guy like Kareem Hunt? Now, I talked about, a stud in Austin Eckler, a guy that has ascended up into the top 12 running backs in Josh Jacobs, a guy that we actually loved at his draft capital this year. Miles Sanders, a guy that some people were completely off of, but he's giving you some performances. What about a guy that was taken later in drafts, a guy like Kareem Hunt? Well, he scored 21 points in week 1, and after week 1, it was the same old song and dance. Kareem Hunt steals goal line touches from Nick Chubb. This is why Nick Chubb can't be a running back 1. This is why he doesn't have any upside. Now, maybe I shouldn't be making fun of Nick Chubb haters the week after he does absolutely nothing, but we've gotten 5 great weeks out of him so far this year. So, hey, I don't care. I'm still going to make fun of you because you're wrong still. But 21 points in week 1. Great. Same thing we've expected from Kareem Hunt. Going to get some goal line touches, going to get some receptions. He's not going to be the lead back, but he's going to get enough touches we can start Chubb and Hunt on any given week. Well, then he puts up 3 straight duds, 8 points, 7 points, and 7 points. This would be a good time to tell you all this is half PPR format. Then we come back in week 5 in a decent game with 13 points in week 5. But then in week 6, in a game in which they lost 38-15, and Kareem Hunt should have seen a ton of targets. 1 target. One target. Didn't even catch it this past week. A third down back who has shown in the past that he is an excellent participant in the passing game, and can make an impact in the passing game, gets 1 target in a game in which they lose 38-15. 38-15. Let me say it one more time for you. They lost 38-15. They've lost 4 games this season, and of those 4 games, we've seen single-digit fantasy points from Kareem Hunt, from a guy that is supposed to be on the field in those situations when the team is playing from behind. How can we predict that the Cleveland Browns have just all of a sudden completely changed their philosophy on using Kareem Hunt, when in the past, you would have seen him out there more often? You can't predict things like that. It is unpredictable, and it just happens. Let's move on to wide receiver, because as hard as running back is to predict, I feel like wide receiver might be the single most difficult position to figure out anything and predict these days, because of what we've seen change over the last couple of years, and we'll talk about that here just in a second. Let's talk about a couple of studs to get things started off, and we're going to talk about the wide receiver 1 in Stefon Diggs, because this goes back to what we talked about with Austin Eckler. You have a top of the first round, or you have for Stefon Diggs, probably top of the second round, maybe late first round pick that's always going to be in your lineup, right? Excellent first week with 22 points. An excellent week 2 with 38 points. And then we go into week 3 going up against a Miami team that has allowed the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And the week before that allowed 43 fantasy points to the Baltimore Ravens wide receivers. Stefon Diggs scores 10 half PPR points. 10. How do you predict that? Because every single number that we would have pulled about that week 3 matchup against Miami would have told us that Stefon Diggs is in an absolute smash position this week. It would have told us that. Because it was. That's what it did tell us. And he scored 10 fantasy points. And then he goes on to score 8 in week 4. Now he's bounced back in 5 and 6 with a 20 and a 25 point day. But you can't predict that. You can't look at all of the numbers that say, yes, this is a great matchup, and then go, holy crap, the dude scored 10 fantasy points against one of the better wide receiver matchups in the league. And then you got a guy like Justin Jefferson, who started off the year with a huge game, 34 points to begin the year, Big step back in week 2, only scores 7 points. And then you look at the matchup going up against Detroit in week 3. Detroit allows the 9th most fantasy points to wide receivers this year. We saw it when A.J. Brown tore him apart in week 1, right? We saw that an alpha wide receiver is going to get after the Lions and is going to make them pay. He scores 2 fantasy points. 2 fantasy points. How do you predict that? Because once again, all the information we have in front of us is telling us Justin Jefferson is going to be a high wide receiver 1 this week. They've got the matchup. They're playing another offense that's putting up numbers, so they're going to have to throw it a little bit. They're facing a secondary that is going to give up some big plays. Nothing from Justin Jefferson. Adam Thielen showed up, though. Hey, good to see you, Adam Thielen. We'll talk about him here in a second. But with Devontae Smith, this is part of the inconsistencies of the wide receiver too. Because again, we've seen a change in philosophy for teams when it comes to wide receivers. And a lot of people are trying to duplicate the Cincinnati Bengals. Because in the 2021 draft, instead of going with at the time, the smart choice of drafting Penei Sewell to help protect Joe Burrow, they decided to add another wide receiver in Jamar Chase. Turned out pretty good. I'll admit, I was one of those people that when they made the draft pick, I said, what are they doing? Penei Sewell's sitting right there. And right now, as of this recording, he's one of the best tackles in all of football. And Cincinnati's offensive line is still struggling, by the way. But they draft Jamar Chase, and now all of a sudden you look at it and you go, what are they doing? They already have 2 good wide receivers. They've got T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. Why would they need another one? This is what teams are starting to do these days. They want to spread it out. They want to go fast. And they want to have as many playmakers on the field as absolutely possible. They want to throw the football, and they want to find as many one-on-one matchups as they possibly can. I mean, you've seen it with other teams. You've seen teams trade for high-end wide receivers this year. Devontae Adams switched teams. Tyreek Hill switched teams. Right? Right now, they're looking at this situation where, number one, they're trying to pair quarterbacks that were with wide receivers in college. They're trying to pair them together. But we're also getting to a point where we're looking at how do we split 3 wide receivers across? Okay, how do we get multiple receiving options on a team at any given time where now we've got to spread all the way out? And if you don't have 3 options, teams are like, I want 2 wide receiver ones. Like, I want 2 guys with the ability to be wide receiver ones. And with Devontae Smith, that's kind of the issue, right? Because with Devontae Smith, excellent rookie season. We know he's not maybe the number 1 wide receiver type. They've got a Dallas Goedert. But they go out and they trade for A.J. Brown, and they get him a guy to play across from him that can be absolute game changer. So now we find ourselves in a situation where, once again, we're having issues trying to figure out who's the guy. And those are what I call the inconsistencies of the wide receiver twos. Because on any given week, they could be the wide receiver 1, see T. Higgins, see Devontae Smith. On any given week, they could completely disappear because the wide receiver 1 is getting all the targets and maybe the ball gets spread out to a couple of other people. 0 points in week 1 for Smith. He bounces back with 11, not bad. Has that huge week 3 with 26. We say, okay, Devontae Smith is back. Boom, back down to 3 the week after. Now he's had 13 and 12 since then, but you can't predict it. Because we're not in there. We don't sit in there with the head coaches when they say we're going to game plan for this week. We can try to maybe figure it out with different matchups and things of that nature, but we can't. We can't from here because we don't know what the game plan is going to be. We don't know who they're going to be going to. What about a guy like Mike Evans? If you take a look at Mike Evans, 15 points. I'm not going to hold week 2 against him. He had 7 points, but he already had 60 receiving yards on Lattimore in the third quarter, and he had 7 fantasy points at that time. If he plays the entire game, he probably goes over 10 fantasy points at least. Maybe he does end up scoring a touchdown. He's suspended the week after. 26 points in week 4. Great bounce back performance. Mike Evans only gets 10 points in week 5. Not bad. Could be a lot better. Week 6. Huge Mike Evans week, ladies and gentlemen. Pittsburgh has allowed the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. They're missing several people on the defensive side of the ball, and he gets 6 fantasy points. How do we predict that? How do we predict, when we looked at all the information, that Mike Evans should absolutely smash this week because of injuries, because of the matchup, because Pittsburgh already had trouble stopping people, because this could be a game where, hey, Tampa Bay is going to get back into the groove of things and they're going to knock it out of the park, and then boom, absolute dud. I mean, how do we predict that? Let's check out Allen Lazard real quick, because this is becoming another issue as well, and it's touchdown dependency. Now, this has always been an issue within football, right? And we've talked about this for years, that it's really hard to buy touchdowns because they're the most difficult stat. They're the most difficult stat to reproduce consistently and replicate consistency. But that goes back to all these teams trying to load up with as many wide receivers as possible, because now scoring becomes less predictable. But then you have a situation where one guy might be getting a ton of volume, but another guy might be scoring. And the guy that's scoring might be scoring a little bit more than the guy getting the volume, but the guy getting the volume tends to be a little bit safer because we know he's going to get targets, and the touchdown, just, if you don't get it, you're not going to get anything. And that's like with Allen Lazard here. Now, no points in week 1, obviously. Week 2, he had 8 points, and then we go 12, 14, 11, and 15. He scored a touchdown in 4 or 5 games this season. In week 2, if he doesn't score that touchdown, he has 2 fantasy points. In week 3, if he doesn't score that touchdown, he has 6 fantasy points. In week 5, he would have only had 5 fantasy points. And this past week in week 6, he would have only had 9 fantasy points. Allen Lazard, if he doesn't score a touchdown, would have gone from being a start to a leave him on your bench because the dude isn't doing anything. How can you predict touchdowns? Again, you can look at all the information in front of you, and you can say to yourself, yep, absolutely. Great matchup. Obviously a chance to score, but if he doesn't score, you're screwed. So if we look at these wide receivers, are they risky because they're touchdown dependent? Are they lucky? Is there going to be regression? How many do they end up scoring? In fact, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty sure I told you all at the beginning of the year, and leave a like for me here if you remember this, that Allen Lazard may only have like 600 receiving yards this year, but he's going to score 12 touchdowns. I'm like 95% sure I said that about Allen Lazard earlier this season, in the offseason. That he was going to be a guy that was going to get you no volume whatsoever, but he was going to score a lot of touchdowns, and it was going to be frustrating because of that. What about the Devin Duvernay? He scored 2 touchdowns in week 1. He had a kickoff return in week 2, or a kick return touchdown in week 2. And then he had 1 touchdown in week 3, 19, 11, and 9. Another guy that is touchdown dependent. That's not getting any volume. That's not getting a ton of yards, but was scoring over the first 3 weeks. And now week after week after week after week, people are like, do I start the Duve? Do I start the Duve? Do I start the Duve? And I'm like, no, you can't start the Duve right now. But guess what? I've been right the last 3 weeks to not start him. But if you start him and he doesn't do anything, it's because he didn't score a touchdown. So if you can't call the touchdown every single week, you're never going to have any idea. What about a guy like Adam Thielen? This is the same thing as Devontae Smith. Wide receiver 2 inconsistencies. 5 points, 7 points. Great week against Detroit in week 15. Justin Jefferson had to completely disappear for it to happen. Then 11 points. Now we're like, okay, and this is the worst part about wide receiver 2 inconsistencies. And I'm going to start calling it wide receiver 2 syndrome. Okay? Because week 5 and 7, he doesn't do anything at all. And you say, okay, maybe I've got to be off of him at this point. Then he goes 15 and 11, and you're like, all right, yep, Adam Thielen's back. Great, feeling really good. And then he goes for 4 points, and you're like, all right, I don't know if I can trust him. And then he goes for 13 points, and you're like, I don't even know what to do anymore. I don't know what to do with him. It's what we're all doing right now because none of us know what to do with the majority of these guys. And again, I only went through several players here. I only went through several of them here. But if I would have sat down with you and did a video on, just think about if we would have talked about Jamar Chase and how inconsistent he has been at times. What about Devontae Adams, who has had absolutely huge games and has disappeared in others? What about A.J. Brown that starts off the year with a ton of receiving yards and we just haven't seen anything from him since? He did score a touchdown this past week. What about all the what about all the running backs we saw inconsistencies with to begin the season? Derrick Henry. Okay. We could sit here for the next few hours. And don't even get me started on the tight end position because tight end is nothing but one big inconsistency. So again, ladies and gentlemen, that's where we're at right now. It is more difficult than ever to predict what is going to happen on any given week. And that's why it is so important for myself and Jake to reiterate to you all that we are trying to change the fantasy football landscape when it comes to how the game is analyzed and how you consume content. We want to put as many statistics, we want to put as much information, we want to put as much research, we want to put as much in front of you as possible. So when you look at it, and you see from us, this is why we're saying we think something will happen this week, you have a better understanding of it and can also use that information to maybe formulate your own opinion. It's the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the beast. And it's so funny when we come back to the comments on Monday and people want to talk crap about how we have no idea what we're talking about. I'm going to clue you in on a secret. Nobody has any idea what they're talking about in this industry. Every single person that is in this industry that considers this any type of a job or a hobby or whatever it may be, they don't have any clue. We're just taking all the information in front of us and trying to make the best possible guess every single week. And when something looks really, really good, we're going to tell you this looks really, really good. And we feel really, really good about it. It's tough out there, ladies and gentlemen. It is. But that's why we're trying to do everything for you to help you make decisions, but also help you understand the thought process and everything else that goes into it. And I'm going to tell you one thing, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get calls wrong every single week. And we put out a video every single week talking about the calls that we got wrong from the week prior. But if you've watched that video, you also see that we get way more calls right, which means we're doing something correctly on our end, which is amazing. For those of you that have started off slow this season, hopefully you're starting to bounce back. We are seeing a few comments right now where people are like, I'm 1-5, 0-6, now having a great season. But we're seeing even more comments right now where people are like, I started 0-2 or I started 1-3 or whatever, and I'm back to 500 now, and it's because I stayed the course and I listened, and you guys have helped supplied me with a bunch of valuable information. I was able to make decisions, and now I'm in a position where I'm still contending for the playoffs. Those comments mean a ton to us. I would rather see those comments than the people who are like, yep, I'm 6-0. I'm 6-0. Because those people have had it easy all season. Y'all haven't. You've had to fight and scrape for every single point as well, and now you're battling back, and that feeling is almost better than being 5-0 and just ripping apart your teammates every single week. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get out of here. All of you stay safe and healthy. Make sure you hit that like button for me. Subscribe if you're new here to the channel. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts on the video. Hopefully you all have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game. Y'all stuck on third down. Your content's plain Jane. Headliners on top now. We gonna move and change. Podcast off the rip. Draft guide, so legit. Fantasy world, our game tight. You know we about that chub life. Stuck in a rut and you need some motivation. Head to the channel for this Headliner Nation. I'm a headliner.